July 15th, 1942. Somewhere over Greenland. Lieutenant Brad McManus looks out the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning. Below him, nothing but white. An endless sea of ice stretching to every horizon. His fuel gauge is dropping, the weather is closing in, and he has no idea where he is. Behind him, 7 more aircraft. 6 P-38 fighters and 2 B-17 bombers. 25 men, all of them lost in a storm over the largest ice sheet in the Northern Hemisphere. In a few hours, every single one of these planes will be on the ground. Not crashed, landed, carefully, on a glacier. The crews will survive. They'll be rescued 9 days later. They'll go home. They'll fight the rest of the war. But their planes will stay behind. The ice will bury them, year after year, snowfall after snowfall. The planes will sink deeper and deeper into the glacier. 50 years later, they'll be found under 80 meters of ice. This is the story of the lost squadron. 8 aircraft that vanished into a glacier, the 50-year search to find them, and the incredible effort to bring one of them back. Her name is Glacier Girl, and she flies again today. To understand how 8 American warplanes ended up buried under a Greenland glacier, you need to understand 1942. America had just entered World War II. Pearl Harbor was 6 months ago. The country was mobilizing for total war. And Britain was desperate for aircraft. The Luftwaffe had nearly destroyed the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain. British factories were producing planes, but not fast enough. American aircraft were needed, thousands of them. But how do you get planes from America to Britain? Ships were one option, but U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at a terrifying rate. Aircraft packed in crates made tempting targets. There was another way. Fly them across. The North Atlantic ferry route. A series of airfields stretching from the United States to Britain, Newfoundland, Greenland, Iceland, Scotland. It was dangerous. The distances were enormous. The weather was unpredictable. Navigation aids were primitive. But it worked. Thousands of aircraft would eventually make the crossing. In July 1942, Operation Bolero was in full swing. American aircraft were being ferried to Britain in preparation for the air war over Europe. On July 15th, a flight of 8 aircraft departed from a base in Greenland. Destination? Iceland. 6 P-38 Lightning fighters, 2 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, 25 crew members. The P-38 was a remarkable aircraft. Twin engines, twin booms, distinctive shape that earned it the nickname Fork-tailed Devil from German pilots. But it had a weakness: range. The P-38 could fly far, but not far enough to cross the Atlantic in one hop. It needed refueling stops. And it had no tolerance for navigation errors. That day, everything went wrong. The flight took off in clear weather, but within hours they flew into a massive storm system. Visibility dropped to 0. Ice began forming on the wings. The flight leader tried to climb above the weather. The clouds went higher. He tried to descend below it. The clouds went lower. They were trapped. 8 aircraft, 25 men. Somewhere over the Greenland ice cap, fuel running low. A decision had to be made. Lieutenant McManus, leading the P-38s, made radio contact with one of the B-17. The bomber had better navigation equipment. Its crew thought they knew where they were. They were wrong. They were nowhere near Iceland. They were over the eastern coast of Greenland, hundreds of kilometers off course. The fuel gauges were touching empty. There was only one option left. Put them down, on the ice. Landing a P-38 on a glacier was not in the flight manual. The aircraft was designed for paved runways. It had tricycle landing gear. The nose wheel was delicate. The belly was full of equipment that would crumple on impact. But the crews had no choice. One by one, the 8 aircraft made their approach. The pilots extended their landing gear. Some retracted it, thinking a belly landing might be safer. Opinions differed. The first P-38 touched down. The wheels hit the snow. The plane bounced, slid, stopped. The pilot was alive. The plane was intact. It had worked. One after another, all 8 aircraft landed on the glacier. Some on their wheels, some on their bellies. All of them more or less in one piece. 25 men stood on the ice, staring at their planes, hardly believing what had just happened. They had survived. But they were stranded, on a glacier, in one of the most remote places on Earth. The first priority was survival. The crews gathered together. They took stock of their supplies: emergency rations, survival gear, radio equipment. The B-17s had better equipment than the P-38s, more food, better radios. The bomber crews shared what they had. The temperature was below freezing. The wind was constant. They had no shelter except the aircraft themselves. They sent out distress signals, SOS. Our position is where? They weren't sure. For 2 days, nobody answered. On the 3rd day, a search aircraft finally spotted them. The crews waved frantically. The pilot dipped his wings in acknowledgement. Help was coming. But reaching them would be another challenge entirely. The glacier where they had landed was riddled with crevasses, hidden cracks in the ice that could swallow a man whole. Any rescue attempt would have to be incredibly careful. Over the next several days, rescue teams worked their way toward the stranded airmen. Dog sleds, motor toboggans, slow, careful progress. On day 9, the rescue team reached them. 25 men, all alive. Cold, hungry, exhausted, but alive. They were evacuated by a combination of dog sled and aircraft. Within a few weeks, they were back in the United States. The mission had been a failure. 8 aircraft lost, but no lives. As failures go, it could have been much worse. But what about the planes? In the chaos of war, 8 aircraft lost on a remote glacier were not a priority. There was talk of recovery efforts, of salvage operations. Nothing happened. The war continued. Resources were needed elsewhere. The planes sat on the ice. Snow fell on them, year after year. By the end of the war, they were already buried. By 1950, they were under several meters of snow and ice. By 1960, they were essentially invisible. The ice sheet was eating them, slowly, inexorably. And the world forgot about them for 40 years. The lost squadron might have been lost forever, if not for one man's obsession. His name was Pat Epps, an aircraft dealer from Atlanta, Georgia, a man who loved vintage warplanes. In the early 1980s, Epps heard about the planes in Greenland, 8 perfectly preserved World War II aircraft buried in ice, waiting to be recovered. He became obsessed. Epps and his partner, Richard Taylor, started researching. They dug through military archives, tracked down survivors, pieced together the story. They knew roughly where the planes had landed. They had coordinates, maps, photographs taken during the rescue operation. But they had no idea what 50 years of ice accumulation had done. In 1981, Epps and Taylor organized their first expedition to Greenland. They brought metal detectors, ice radar, hopes and dreams. They found nothing. The plains weren't where they expected. The coordinates were off. The glacier had moved. 50 years of snowfall had buried everything. They returned home, regrouped, tried again the next year. Nothing. And again, and again. 10 expeditions over 11 years, thousands of dollars spent, endless frustration. Each time they got a little closer, refined their techniques, learned more about how glaciers work. The key insight came from understanding ice dynamics. Glaciers don't just bury things vertically, they move. The planes had landed 50 years ago at a certain location, but the ice had been flowing slowly toward the coast ever since. The planes had moved, horizontally, by kilometers. And they had sunk, not just from snow accumulation, but from the weight of the ice pressing down, compacting, densifying. By the early 90s, the calculations suggested the planes were under at least 60 meters of ice, maybe more. In 1992, everything changed. They found them. Using advanced ice-penetrating radar, the team finally located the aircraft. Shadows on a screen, shapes that could only be man-made. The planes were there, under the ice, exactly where the physics said they should be. 75 meters down, 250 feet of solid ice, between the surface and a fleet of World War II aircraft. Now came the hard part, getting them out. How do you extract a 38-foot airplane from 75 meters of glacial ice? Very, very carefully. The team developed a technique they called the gopher, a device that could melt a shaft straight down through the ice using hot water. It was slow, painstaking, dangerous. The shaft had to be wide enough for workers to descend, for equipment to be lowered, for airplane parts to be raised. But the ice was unstable. The shaft could collapse, freeze over, flood with meltwater. They worked through the brief Greenland summer, a few months of marginal temperatures when operations were possible. Then winter would come, and they would have to leave, return the next year, start again. Year after year, getting deeper, getting closer. In 1992, they reached the first aircraft, a P-38 Lightning, tail number 41791. It was crushed, twisted. The weight of 75 meters of ice had compressed it like a beer can. The planes were not perfectly preserved, as they had hoped. They were damaged, badly, but not destroyed. The team began extracting pieces, wings, engines, fuselage sections. Each piece had to be cut free, lifted through the shaft, and transported to the surface. It took years, multiple expeditions, endless work. By 1995, they had recovered enough parts to begin reconstruction. One P-38 would fly again. Rebuilding the aircraft was arguably harder than finding it. The recovered P-38 was not one plane. It was pieces of several planes, supplemented by parts from other sources. The fuselage was crushed. It had to be reconstructed from scratch, using the original as a template. The engines were damaged but salvageable. They were carefully restored, piece by piece. The work took years. A team of dedicated restorers worked obsessively, matching parts, fabricating what couldn't be found, maintaining absolute authenticity. They weren't building a replica. they were resurrecting an original. In 2002, 10 years after recovery, 60 years after she disappeared into the ice, Glacier Girl flew again. The restored P-38 took off from an airfield in Kentucky. She climbed into the sky. She banked, turned, performed perfectly. A plane that had spent half a century under a glacier was flying. The crowd cheered. Veterans wept. History had come alive. She had waited 60 years for this moment. Today, Glacier Girl is one of the most famous warbirds in the world. She appears at air shows across America. Thousands of people come to see her, to hear her engines, to touch a piece of history. Most of them know the story: the crash landing, the burial, the recovery, the resurrection. But what many don't know is what happened to the rest. 7 other aircraft are still under the ice. 5 more P-38s, 2 B-17, buried even deeper now than when Glacier Girl was recovered. The ice doesn't stop. Every year more snow falls, more pressure builds. The planes sink deeper. There have been discussions of recovering more aircraft. The B-17s would be particularly valuable. Few remain airworthy anywhere in the world. But the cost is enormous. The logistics are nightmarish, and the planes are now over 100 meters down. They may stay there forever. There's a philosophical question buried in this story. Should we recover these planes? Spend millions of dollars to dig machines out of ice? Some say yes. These are historical artifacts, pieces of our heritage. They should be preserved, displayed, celebrated. Others say no. Let them rest. The ice is a kind of tomb, a natural monument to the men who flew them. The men themselves had varied opinions. Some survivors of the original crash wanted the planes recovered. They wanted to see them fly again, to know that their story would be remembered. Others felt differently. The planes belonged to the ice now. Leave them be. Both positions have merit. What's undeniable is the power of the story. 8 planes, 25 men, a crash landing on a glacier, 50 years of burial, a decade-long search, a resurrection. It's almost too perfect, too dramatic. But it happened, all of it. And somewhere in Greenland, under the weight of accumulating centuries, 7 more planes wait in darkness. Perhaps one day, someone will go back for them. Let's talk about what we can learn from the lost squadron. First, the ice sheet is dynamic. It's not a static, frozen wasteland. It moves. It grows. It's not static. It buries things faster than anyone expected. In 50 years, the plane sank 75 meters. That's roughly 1.5 meters per year. Climate scientists use data like this to understand how ice sheets behave. The lost squadron became an accidental scientific experiment. Second, the human drive to recover the past is powerful. Pat Epps and Richard Taylor spent 11 years searching for these planes. They faced failure after failure. They could have given up 100 times. They didn't. Something compelled them to keep going, to see it through. Third, technology makes the impossible possible. In 1942, recovering a plane from under 75 meters of ice would have been unthinkable. By 1992, it was merely extremely difficult. Radar that could see through ice, heating systems that could melt shafts, engineering techniques that didn't exist a generation earlier. What will be possible in another 50 years? The remaining planes may not be out of reach forever. The story of the lost squadron has one more chapter. The 25 men who survived the crash landing, what happened to them? They went back to the war. They flew more missions. Some became aces. Some were shot down. Some survived the war. Some didn't. Carl Rudder, the pilot of one of the P-38s, flew combat missions over North Africa and Europe. He survived the war. He attended the first flight of Glacier Girl in 2002. He stood on the tarmac, an old man now, watching a plane he had last seen 60 years ago rise into the sky. What must that have felt like? To see something from your youth, something you thought was gone forever, come back to life. Most of the original crew members have passed away now. The last survivors attended air shows, gave interviews, shared their memories. But their story lives on, in the aircraft, in the ice, in the history books. They did their duty. They survived against the odds. And now, 8 decades later, their adventure is still being told. The Lost Squadron reminds us of something important. The past is never really gone. It's just waiting. Buried under ice, hidden in archives, forgotten in memories. But it can be recovered, excavated, restored. Sometimes literally. Glacier Girl flies today because people refuse to let history stay buried. Because obsession, technology, and stubbornness combined to pull the past into the present. And somewhere in Greenland, 7 more planes wait for someone with the same combination. Maybe that person is watching this video right now. If you found this story incredible, subscribe to the channel. This is the second video in our Greenland World War II series. We've covered the secret Arctic war between Danish hunters and Nazi spies. Now, the Lost Squadron. Next, the mineral that built 300,000 Allied aircraft, cryolite, the most valuable rock you've never heard of, found in only one place on Earth, Greenland. This frozen island keeps revealing its secrets. Now you know.